Welcome back to Train Signal. This is Elias Kanaser and you're watching Configuring Fabric Resources. This is going to be probably the pinnacle of my lessons in this course because I strongly feel that this is the lesson that you are going to truly understand what cloud computing means, what a private cloud means to you, and what your new role is going to be. This is the lesson that you're going to be able to it's going to click. You're going to be like, I got it. Now, I'm so confident of that I literally want you, after the completion of this lesson, to tweet to me. My Twitter sign is at eKnaser, EKHNASER, and either tell me, yes, you were right, or no, you weren't right, then we're going to watch the next lesson. So we're going to talk about a lot of things in this lesson. We're going to talk about networking resources. We're going to talk about storage resources. In networking, we're going to talk about the fabric. This is a new concept. What is the fabric? Why do I need the fabric? We're going to talk about IP address pools, specifically about static IP address pools. Now, you're familiar with probably the DHCP type IP address pools, and this is not going to be very different, but we're going to talk about it. Talk about MAC address pools. We're going to talk about load balancers and VIP templates. So we're going to talk about a lot of things. Now let's take a look at the storage resources. In here we're going to talk about SMIS. We're going to talk specifically about the connection that we're going to make between the virtual machine management server and the storage enabled SMIS array that we have. And we're also going to talk about storage classifications. What does storage classification mean? Why it's important to me? So what does this private cloud computing mean? Why is it important to me? Well, private cloud computing is all about abstraction. Now, I talked a little earlier on about the fabric. Well, what is the fabric, Eli? I already can make connections through my Hyper-V host, through my ESX host, through my Zen server host. Through my hypervisor, I can make connections to my storage, my network, all of the above. Why do I need this new fabric and what is it? Let's talk about how the fabric is a new abstraction layer and how that is going to help you. Now, let's take a look at what traditionally we would do. So traditionally we would have, let's call them Hyper-V hosts. They might be ESX hosts. Again, they might be Zen server hosts. They might be a whole slew of different types of hosts. So your task as an administrator would be to deploy the hypervisor, configure the hypervisor, get everything up and running from a networking perspective. Very basic networking at that point, right? Now, once the hypervisor is connected, you make connections. You start creating logical virtual switches. This is your networking layer, correct? And you are creating these connections to the network so that later on you can get your virtual machines to connect to them. Conversely, you're doing the same thing with your storage. So you have storage down here, whether it's SAN, iSCSI, NFS, whatever the case is. You have the storage down here, and sometimes your storage, you're classifying your storage, for instance, as tier 1 if it happens to be an SSD storage, right? So this would be your tier 1. Maybe tier 2 is maybe it's 15K SAS, right? And then maybe your tier 3 is maybe 10K or even 15K SATA. This is your, it's the slowest type of disk that you have. Typically, in a traditional environment, you have your virtualization administrator that sits typically at this layer, obviously. Then you have your networking administrator and you have your storage administrator. And when you want to configure storage for these hosts, you're always communicating with your storage administrator to figure out which host is going to connect to which tier of storage. Sometimes they might be connecting to all of them, right? That's typically what we have in our environments, is something that kind of looks like this messy picture. Up here from a networking perspective, we're kind of doing the same thing. So up here, maybe you have access to VLAN 1, right? And maybe conversely, you're doing the same thing for VLAN 2 and maybe the same thing for VLAN 3. And you have access to all these types of networks, maybe even if it's configured properly, to a DMZ, correct? So you're requesting all of these connections from your networking administrator, and then you are, as the virtualization administrator, making your host connections. You're configuring your virtual switches in order to prepare your environment so that when you go to create your virtual machines, you can place the virtual machines on the tier of storage that you find appropriate depending on the application that's going to get installed on it. And then you're connecting that virtual machine to the network that it needs to connect on in order to communicate with the other business services that it requires to communicate with. You're doing all of these manually. In addition to all of that, on these, hypervisor hosts, you are creating virtual machines, right? Now, these virtual machines, what are you doing to them? You are installing an operating system. You are assigning a static IP address. You are giving a name to this virtual machine. You are essentially personalizing. You're giving it a personality. This virtual machine is getting a personality. And then again, you're placing it on the appropriate storage and you're connecting it with all the networking stuff that it needs to be connected to. Now, in addition to all of that, what else could you possibly be doing? Some of these virtual machines might need access to load balancers. So it's very, very possible that as part of what you're doing, you're also placing this virtual machine, placing a load balancer in front of it so that, maybe you have multiple instances of this virtual machine. The load balancer will be able to then direct your users, depending on a set of rules, etc., to the most appropriate VM based on traffic and a whole set of other things. So you're creating all of this manually. You are the administrator, you are the king of your domain, you're it, right? Now, all of this you are currently abstracting from the users. The user is typically your business owner, maybe your applications owner. They will come to you and say, we need these services. We need an SAP virtual machine, and we need an Epic virtual machine if they're in healthcare, and we need a cache database or a SQL database or an Exchange front end or a file server front end. You gather all these requirements, all the business requirements, and then you go about doing your thing. And then, a week or two later, you deliver these virtual machines that are now ready to accept applications from the application owners. This typically will take up to, 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 day, depending on how quick you are, how much you have this nailed down, how much you have connections to the networking group, what the change management looks like, the storage groups, etc. So this is typically what we do. This is our current job as IT. Now, let's take a look at something else before I tell you how this is changing. Now, traditionally, as IT, we already have an abstraction layer from our developers. So the developers are the ones that are writing, all these codes, and traditionally the first thing they gave us was an interface that was very similar to a CLI. Remember the Unix days and the DOS days and all those days where the code, the actual code, those scripts, the logic that the developers have created, they've created the CLI, and we've created the role of an admin here. This admin mastered the CLI, understood how to use it to execute commands and configure commands. But the developers, this CLI is my abstraction layer from the code, from the actual heart of what it's supposed to do. But somebody actually created this for me and made it easy for me and automated these scripts and wrote them in a way so where I'm executing a command, it executes multiple things based on that command. Now the CLI obviously later evolved, right? And it evolved into the GUI. So now instead of me seeing a command line and I have to type in a command line, I can use my mouse and go about clicking things. Now these things that I'm clicking also correlate to logic that the developers have created and have abstracted from me using this GUI, this easy to use interface for me to execute. Again, the focus here was the admin, right? Well, the world has changed today. With the advent of consumerization, with the fact that users now can go out and provision virtual machines on an Amazon cloud or on a Windows Azure for that matter, using a credit card and be up and running in a matter of minutes. Because my users can now go get Office 365 and be up and running with similar services to the ones that I offer in my enterprise, but cheaper and quicker. If it takes me 2 weeks to deliver this, they can get a virtual machine from Amazon and go about doing their business in a few minutes. Actually, that is currently a problem for a lot of organizations where the marketing department doesn't even wait on IT anymore. They'll go out to Amazon, they'll go out to Azure, and they will get the right virtual machines that they need to get their campaigns done, everything done. And then when they're done with those virtual machines, they don't even have the knowledge of understanding the ramifications of not destroying the data and leaving the data on these cloud providers. So that poses a risk, but they're getting their job done. If you remember in earlier lessons when I was talking about the fact that users today are not afraid of IT anymore. They come to IT and if IT can't deliver something, well, they have the approach of I'll go do it myself because there's technology out there that enables them to do that. So this abstraction layer that has existed forever in IT has now been elevated a level. It still exists between the developers and the admins, but the admin's job now with a private cloud has been elevated. So instead of you just playing around with your GUI and going about doing all of this, now your responsibility is to build an environment, and we're going to call this the private cloud, the PC, where you're abstracting all of this from the user, which is what you're doing today, with one caveat. You have to be able to now enable this user to do it himself or herself. So the user has to be able to have access to some kind of a console, some kind of a web portal, where they can go to this web portal and using a very simplified GUI, an even simpler GUI than the one that you're given from your developers, in order to provision all of the resources which we're going to later on call services. So if they want to deploy SAP with an Oracle backend, and that requires maybe 3 virtual machines to get that done, they should be able to provision this entire SAP service from a web portal or a console and be able to place it on the right network that they need, place it on the right tier of storage that they need without knowing what this tier of storage means. They don't need to know where SSD is, where SATA is. No. What you're going to give them is simplified options. So instead of having VLAN 123 and a DMZ, VLAN 123 to a user means nothing. What your job is going to be is to create simple things. For instance, you'll give them 3 options: LAN, WAN, and this is just simplified obviously, and DMZ. These are things they can understand. Well, oh, this is going to be accessed from the WAN or maybe from the outside on the internet. Oh, this is going to be only on the LAN. This is going to be on the DMZ. And then depending on which geographic area that request is coming from, it's your responsibility to automatically place it on the right hosts in the environment that have access to these networks that you've made available to them, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Conversely, what you're going to give them is the option of selecting the tier of storage, right? So you have your storage classified, for example, in terms of services, maybe as platinum, maybe as gold, and maybe as silver. And each one of those, here's the beauty of it, right? So each one of those, everybody's going to see like, wow, platinum is the highest level, so I'm going to put all of my services on platinum. Well, guess what? That is associated with a dollar amount. That's where chargebacks and showbacks come into play. So if that developer chooses to use a platinum classification of storage, then they're going to pay a premium for that platinum classification of storage. And whenever money is involved, now that developer, now that requester, now that user, whoever is making the request is going to think twice about it, because now they're going to get dinged, they're going to be charged. So they're not going to abuse the storage classification or the network classification or anything like that. So we're going to create those for them. We're also going to create the ability, if a user requests or needs a load balancer in front of those virtual machines, well, we're going to have a checkbox for them to be able to say load balancer, and then automatically, and again, depending on where they're coming from, we've done all the work, we've done all the homework, we've pre-provisioned everything, it's going to deploy a load balancer in front of their environment. So your job now is to create a similar console to the one you've been given from developers that is significantly more simplified, where users can provision this very complex and lengthy process down to minutes. Not weeks, not hours, down to minutes. But in order for us to be able to pre-provision, in order for us to automate and orchestrate all of this, it's going to take time. So this is where the private cloud is very resource intensive in the beginning until you get it set up and configured and ready to go. And after that, that's where it becomes easy, because then you're just governing and making sure everything is healthy and everything is working and you're not running out of disk and you have enough ports. Whatever you need to do as an administrator becomes easier. And I'll give you examples of how this is going to work. we're going to talk about, well, how am I going to pre-provision static IP addresses? We're going to take the same approach that we have at the desktop side, which is to use something very similar to a DHCP, except DHCP is going to issue dynamic addresses that expire every 7 days or 8 days or 30 days or whatever the case is. The IP address pool that we're going to be talking about here is a pool of static IP addresses that you can assign to virtual machines when they are requested. We're going to figure out how we're going to deploy that operating system, how it's going to get named, how we're going to give it the DNS server. All of the things, again, that we did manually, we're going to now orchestrate and automate so that the user finds simple. Let's go ahead and log in to our management PC first and take a look at what we need to do there. Alright, so the first thing that I want to do is start with the basics of the fabric. Now the fabric deals with three main things. It deals with servers, it deals with networks, and it deals with storage. So from a server's perspective, what I'm going to do here is we're going to do something, well, let me show you something real quick. So if you click on fabric, you'll see that it deals again with servers, with network, and with storage. The first thing I want to do is I want to create a new host group that I can now add my hosts to. Now keep in mind, we're not creating the cluster yet. We have a dedicated lesson for that, but I just want to group them in a new dedicated host group, which also has some properties that I'm going to show you in a second. So to do that, I'm going to right click here and I'm going to click on Create Host Group, and I'm going to name this prod. Once it's created, I'm going to take my Hyper-V hosts and I'm just going to drag and drop each one of them into this new host group. And voila. Once that is ready, what I'm going to do now, just to show you real quick, we're going to right click on prod and we're going to drag down to properties. There are some properties in here that you can take a look at. You can change the name, obviously. You can give it a description if you choose to do so. You can allow unencrypted file transfers, again, if you choose to do so. There's some placement rules that you can deal with. We're going to talk a lot more about host reserves and dynamic optimization here when we talk about clustering. But you have some networking options that you can configure. There's some storage, which is all of the things that we're going to be doing, and then you have some custom properties that you can also apply to it. So once we've created this host group, now let's go focus a little bit on the fabric. And in the fabric, what I want to start off with is the networking component of things. So if you click on logical networks here, you'll find that it's already imported one of the logical networks. Now let's talk about this real quick. In an earlier lesson, I had shown you down here in the settings window when we were talking about the initial configuration of networking. Let me show you here real quick. If we go to General and down here to where it says Network Settings, we didn't spend much time on that, so let me clarify this a little more for you. So what this deals with essentially is every time you add a host to Virtual Machine Manager, if that host has pre-configured virtual networking on that host, then it's going to try and match the virtual networking that's on that host to a logical network within Virtual Machine Manager, which is why making sure that you have all of your hosts configured the same way from a virtual networking perspective is going to be essential for you to make sure that there's no inconsistency here. Again, if you find that this is causing problems, you can always come here and disable this feature. However, because I've configured all of my virtual switches the same way on all of my hosts, I am comfortable keeping this on because as I'm importing them, I know that they are going to match because they're all configured the same way. So again, you have the ability to automatically create the logical networks, that's enabled. And you have the ability of automatically creating virtual switches, that's also enabled. Now up here from a logical networking matching perspective, you have different subsets, different criteria by which you are creating this match between, and you have primary and you have secondary, between your hosts that are being imported into VM. So if I click on cancel here, let's go into Fabric now, and again, this is what was imported by default under my logical network. So if I go out here and right click on it and we drag down to properties, you'll find that it's very basic. It's giving it again just a basic name here, and you can give it a description if you choose to do so. You have some options for network sites within this logical network are not connected, so essentially you're creating isolations here. Allow VM networks created on this logical network to use network virtualization. This is when we're getting into advanced networking concepts as well. For now, I want to talk about network sites. This is where you're creating that geographical location, call it that subnet maybe. It could be a VLAN, just one VLAN, or an aggregate of several VLANs. So in order to do this, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to click on Add. You'll find that it automatically added my logical network here. I want to associate this logical network now with a host group. So I've already created the host group in an earlier step, which is called prod. I'm just going to click on prod. Now again, remember what we were talking about on the whiteboard. I am creating this infrastructure, this networking construct that will later allow me to create automations and orchestrations against it. So we created the host groups, and we're saying that these hosts that are in the prod environment that have those virtual networks that were configured individually on each one, we're going to give them access inside of virtual VMM to logical networks now. So for those of you that are familiar with vSphere and vCenter, this is very similar to how you would configure a virtual switch, and down here this is very similar to how you would add, again, VLANs to a virtual switch. So what are we going to do now? So I want to now create that network. What is this going to be connecting to? I'm going to go ahead and click on Insert Row here. Insert Row, if you give the VLAN a value, then it will tag all the packets that are going out with that value back and forth, so it's only traversing, or the transport is only going through that VLAN. If you leave it blank, it won't give it a VLAN. I don't have a VLAN number to give at this point, so I'm just going to leave it blank. I do, however, have a subnet that I want to associate this with. So what we're going to do is do 192.168.1.0, and we're going to give it a /24 subnet mask bit, right? So this is what I'm doing. Now, there's no reason why you couldn't add another row if you wanted to, and then create another VLAN here. Again, now, for those of you that are familiar with this, this is the VLAN ID. That's starting to kind of resonate of you're able to create multiple subnets within this logical network that you're creating. It makes it easy for you to deal with, and instead of having separate virtual switch for everything, now you're able to have those VLAN connections, and you don't need all those physical interfaces, for those of you that remember what I'm talking about at this point. So again, I don't need anything more than just this for now. We've made the association. We have our logical network here. We're ready to go, so I'm just going to go ahead and click on OK. If you wanted to change the site name, you can do that down here. All right, now that we have a logical network configured and we have our sites configured and we've pretty much done some basic networking configuration, now we have to create some kind of a type of port so that we can attach it to a virtual machine so that virtual machine's NIC can gain access to the outside world. This in the vSphere world is called port groups. This is where you specify a type of access. Well, so far we've created again our logical network, our sites, but now we have to create our VM network so that we can give our virtual machines, once we start creating them, some kind of a way to attach to the outside network. Now to do that, let's go back up into VMs and services. And on this screen, you'll notice on the left here the node VM networks. Make sure that you have your view set to VM networks so that you can see what we want to create here. And then when you're ready, we're just going to right click on it and we're going to click on Create VM Network. This gives you the option, okay, name this. What do you want this to be? I'm just going to keep it simple and name it VM Network here. And we want to attach this to the logical network that we just created, which is the Wired Brain Coffee. So that's the only one anyway in our list, but we want to attach it to what we've just created. Now on the left, you'll see that you have some rules here, or some tabs that you can go through and configure. So for instance, obviously you can give this a description, but once you're ready, the next step here is to what type of isolation do you, if any, do you want to give this network that you're about to create. So you can isolate this using Hyper-V network virtualization. So this is essential if you're trying to do things like multi-tenants and you're trying to isolate your environment somehow. You can use network virtualization to do that. For now, for my purpose, for the purpose of our example, we don't really need any kind of network isolation, and our network virtualization isn't set up for this, so we're just going to leave it with no isolation. We're going to click on Next, and you're going to get a summary screen, bada bing, bada boom, and voila. It's going to create this automatically. Once you have a VM network, then when we're going about creating virtual machines, now you have something to attach that virtual NIC to so that they can gain access to the rest of the network and to the internet if that's the case. Let's go back into the fabric now. Once that's created, what I want to do now is I want to create that static IP pool. Very simple, right click, go to create IP pool. And what you're going to find here is this is going to look extremely similar to what a DHCP configuration would look like through, traditional Windows setup for the most part. So for here, I'm just going to call this prod static pool. I'm going to associate it with this particular logical network. Again, if I hadn't right-clicked, if you had more than one, you can associate it with a different one. You can give it a different description if you choose to do so. We're going to click on Next here to continue. Do you want to use an existing network site or do you want to create a site? I'm just going to use an existing network site that we've just created, which is associated with everything. Again, if you create one, it depends on where you've started in the wizard. This is giving you flexibility here of if you don't have one or if you've started at a different place in the wizard, you can go out and create another one. Click Next to continue. This is where it's going to look familiar to you, right? So this is typically in DHCP where you would set your starting IP addresses and your ending IP addresses. The difference, though, is here these are static IP addresses, which means these are going to be assigned to the virtual machine and they will never expire. Whereas with DHCP, they always get expired and they're always in that pool. So for me, what I'm going to do here, we are going to give from 80 to, let's say, 99. So I have a total of 20 IP addresses that I can use. Now, down here, conversely, if we want to give our users the ability to use load balancers, VIPs for that matter, you can reserve IP addresses that are going to be used specifically for load balancers. Similarly, if you have another function other than load balancers that you want to reserve IP addresses for, again for automatic and orchestrated deployments, you could put it in this field down here. For now, I'm going to leave both of these blank and I'm just going to click on Next. You want to specify a default gateway. Again, this should look very familiar to you now from a DHCP perspective. What we're going to do here is I'm just going to enter my default gateway of 192.168.1.1 and I'm just going to leave the metric at automatic. Next up, DNS, again, very, very familiar here. What I'm going to do with this one is let's do 192.168.1.14, and I'm actually going to add another one, which is 192.168.1.1. And I am going to arrange them so that this particular one is higher. So I want this the order to be. From a DNS suffix perspective, I'm just going to enter wiredbraincoffee.com. I'm going to click on Next. If you're still using Wins, I feel sorry for you, but if you're not, then you can leave this blank. Click on Next to continue, summary, and finish. You have this excellent jobs window here that's showing you everything that's going on. And I'm just going to go ahead and close out of there. And we've created now the static IP pool. Now, you can also create MAC address pools, right? So it's created one by default for me, which is the default MAC address pool. If I take a look at that, it's essentially just giving me the MAC address ranges that I have configured here. For the most part, for most of you, you'll probably leave this at default. You won't change this. But if in your organization there's a need to have specific MAC addresses, then you can come in here and make those modifications. If you want to specify any inactive MAC addresses, then again you can come in here and add those. For me, I'm just going to leave those at their default configurations. From a load balancer's perspective, you have the default Microsoft load balancing. This is typically where you would come in and add any third-party load balancers that are out there that are software-based. So it would be very similar. You can right-click and add load balancer. In my case, I don't have anything to add here, and I haven't installed any software that would allow integration from a load balancing perspective with VMM so that I can add it. This is typically what you would get again from your third-party manufacturer. From a Microsoft load balancing perspective, again, this is the default that we'll probably be using for now. And then down here from a VIP templates perspective, This is where, again, you're creating some automation in terms of, well, what are you making available for these load balancers so that users can use? What are the services? So if I right click on it and create a VIP template, let's say I was going to create something, I don't know, maybe for port 80 or something for SSL or HTML or whatever the case is. The template name, I'm just going to call this LAN. And let's call this WAN. And the port, the default port here, let's do the virtual IP port of 80. You can put a description if you choose to do so. This is where if you had, again, a specific template from a third party, you can come in here and specify it. Maybe you're using a Microsoft network load balancer. If you had another one from F5 or Citrix or Cisco or anyone else, you can select that. You can also go with generic, which is what I'm going to do in my case. Again, it's giving you very basic concepts here. What are you trying to do? You want to create, is this coming over HTTP? Are you trying to create an HTTP pass-through? Maybe this is a NetScaler, a secure gateway, an F5, something of that nature. You can specify, again, how to configure that load balancer. So what you're doing here is a VIP template is basically asking you, what is the profile of what you're trying to do? What are you trying to create so that it automatically creates those rules and that environment for you? So I'm going to select that. If you click on next, you can enable persistence so that it's always coming to a particular virtual machine through that load balancer if that's something that you want to do. Click next here. This is where you can configure, health checks or monitoring essentially. What are you trying to configure is to ensure that, every so often you're able to communicate with the service to make sure that it's always up and running. So you can, click on insert and you have a bunch of options that you can choose from here. Maybe it's just a ping, maybe it's something to that nature, and you're able to configure that again from a monitoring perspective so that you know that that service is still up and running. If you click on next, the last thing that you can do here is the load balancing method. What are you trying to do? Are you trying to balance this on the amount of connections that are going through the load balancer? So it will, as soon as it receives that connection, it's going to direct it to the virtual machine with the least amount of connections. Or you can do it to the fastest response time, or just round robin. So one to the VM1, one to VM2, one to VM1, one to VM2 with no logic whatsoever. Fastest response time is between VM1 and VM2. Which one is responding quicker? I will direct the traffic to, and least connections. You have VM1 and VM2. VM1 has 10 connections. VM2 has 2 connections. I'll direct it to VM2, kind of thing. Now, I'm not going to create this VIP template, but this is essentially what you would go through in order to get that created and make that available. Again, we don't have anything right now from a load balancing perspective put in place, but I just wanted to show you how this would work. All right, moving on. Now we can talk about switch extension managers. So switch extension managers are when you have virtual switches that are provided to you from a third party. For instance, the Cisco Nexus 1000V. If you're using a virtual switch that Cisco is providing, then you can configure it in here through switch extensions by installing the right software and being able to, you'll simply right click and add virtual machine extension manager. Right now it'll give me an error because I don't have anything configured. But once that's configured, then you can use the third-party vendors management console and command line interface to interact with the virtual switch. Now, the next sections down here are going to deal with how to centralize the management of virtual networks across multiple hosts, but more importantly, how to standardize them. So today, what we've been doing so far is you create or you deploy Hyper-V, and then you configure Hyper-V, and then you import Hyper-V into VMM. After you've created the right virtual networking, and then you can try to do the matching thing that I showed you earlier on. But with some of the logical switches that we have here, some of the native port profiles that we have here, we can create that standard. So as we're adding these hosts into VMM, they are immediately applied with the right configuration for the virtual network, for the physical network, and they are connected to the right switches. So the order by which we would go to create these is, let's start from the bottom here. Gateways are pretty much self-explanatory. If you wanted to add any kind of gateway, you can click on Add Gateway and add it here. I don't have anything to add at this point, so I'm just going to stick with the basic default configuration that I have. Port classifications are going to be very similar to what we've been talking about from a storage classifications perspective. Now with storage classifications, we mentioned how you could have tier 1 disk, tier 2 disk, tier 3 disk, and those can correlate to SSD, to SATA, to SAS, and so on and so forth. Well, port classifications are very similar, whereas storage classifications were essentially a label that you then correlate to an actual physical device. In that case, it was SSD or SATA. Port classifications are also kind of labels that you're creating that you will later associate with a native port profile, which is essentially that physical instance that you're associating this with. So from a port classification perspective, you have some ports that have been created for you by default. You'll notice if you double click, for instance, on SRIOV here, there's really nothing to configure. It's essentially just a label that we will then correlate with a native port profile. So if you wanted to create your own port classifications here, for instance, let's say you wanted to do one for fast, maybe, I don't know, we can just right click on it, click on create port classification, and maybe you want to name this fast. From a description perspective, maybe you want to give this 10 gig Ethernet, for example. You click on OK, and that's going to show up in your list here. Maybe you want to do another one, I don't know, maybe you want to call this one slow, and maybe slow correlates to 1 gig, right? So you're creating these classifications here, and then where you configure them essentially is under the native port profiles here. And you'll find that under the native port profiles, you also have these profiles that have been pre-created for you that correlate with some of the defaults that were down here in port classification. So for instance, we double clicked on SRIOV under port classification. You can find it right here, right? So you can double click on it, and it's automatically configured all the basic settings for SRIOV for you already. So all you have to do is essentially, even that correlation is made. So if you're using any of the defaults, you're all good, right? Your security settings are configured, your bandwidth settings are configured, all of that is great. Now, we created a port classification. If you wanted to go through and create a native port profile for it, then you simply right click, create native port profile, and you can give this a name, right? So let's say we were going to do this for fast. You would do this way, again, you can do 10 gig Ethernet here, and then you would go through configuring this particular native port profile. So you can configure it against your uplinks, or you can configure it against the virtual network adapters. Now obviously the uplinks are the physical uplinks that are being passed through from the actual physical Hyper-V host, right? So if you select, for instance, uplink here, you're going to be prompted for, well, where do you want me to get these from? And you have the option of selecting that. So many different options that you can choose from here. If for our purposes, and you'll see that if you go through the uplinks, there's really not much to configure here. But if you go through and you select, for instance, your virtual network adapter port groups, port profiles, you can come in here, and then you're going to get all the options that I was showing you earlier from what was available through the defaults, right? So if you come in here, and then you have the option of selecting what are you trying to do here. You want to allow MAC spoofing, you don't want to allow it, you want to enable DHCP guard. So you have a lot of options here to configure. You can configure the bandwidth that you're providing for this particular native port profile. So I'm not actually going to configure anything here since we're not going to use it. This is a little bit more advanced networking that's outside of the scope of this course. I just wanted to show you where things were. So I'm going to go ahead and click on cancel. And then I want to show you, once you have a port classification and a native port profile, then you have the option of coming in here and creating that logical switch. So if you select logical switch, right click on it, click on create logical switch, you're going to be greeted with this beautiful getting started screen. We're going to click on next to continue. You can give this a name, right? So I can call mine SW1. Now keep in mind, we're actually not going to create a switch. Again, I'm just going to take you through these prompts, but we're not creating it because it's outside of the scope of what we're trying to do. But once you create that switch, you give it a label. Essentially here you have the option of either enabling a single port I/O virtualization, SRIOV, against for load balancing purposes. It could be for bandwidth. It could be for 100 reasons that you can enable this. We're not going to enable it at this point, but it's available. It's supported. We're going to click on next here. You have the option of choosing the filter. How are you going to associate this with? What type of a virtual switch extension? Right now, the only one that I have by default is the Microsoft one. So I'm going to keep that one selected. Click on next here. And here you have the option of, again, associating this with uplinks. So right now it's no uplinks are selected. You can essentially come down here and say I want to team this, for instance. Maybe select here, well, what are you trying to team it from? I don't have, again, anything configured for this in particular at this point, but you could come in here and again select what you're trying to team this with. Remember, in the earlier step here in the native profiles, we didn't create anything for the uplinks, so nothing is showing up for me here. So I'm going to keep this at no uplink, and then if we click on next, you have the option of, well, now you can associate with virtual ports, right? So if I click on virtual ports here, let's go ahead and increase this up here, and you have the option of clicking on browse, and voila, they all show up here as far as these default port classifications and native port that we've created here for you. So this deals with the port profile classifications that we have. So for instance, you can select SRIOV if you wanted to, click on OK, and now you've specified that as a port classification. You can also choose to include a virtual network adapter port profile in this adapter, in this virtual port if you wanted to do that. We're not going to include anything other than the default port classification here, so I'm just going to click on OK. Now if we go through, you click on next, and bada bing bada boom, you've just created your first essentially logical switch. Again, we're not going to go ahead and create that. It's a little bit outside of the scope of what we're trying to do, but I just wanted to show you, well, how you would go about doing this. But this is, again, a lot advanced networking than what we're trying to cover in this course here. Now with that, let's move on to storage. Now before we can configure storage, there's a couple of tasks that we want to do at the Hyper-V level before we can come in here and configure storage. So what I want to do is I want to switch over to Hyper-V 1 and walk you through those configurations. And those configurations you'd want to, after this lesson is over, or if even you want to pause it, apply those to Hyper-V 2 and Hyper-V 3 so that you are up to par again with what I'm doing in my lab. I've already done those configurations on Hyper-V 2 and Hyper-V 3, and I'm going to show you how to do it on Hyper-V 1. Alright, so the first thing I want to do here is I want to enable my iSCSI initiator. To do that, I'm going to go to the Start menu here, and we are going to go to Administrative Tools. But before that, you'll see that I've properly configured the multipathing I/O earlier on when we were dealing with the configuration of the Hyper-V host in an earlier lesson. So again, if you don't see this, you probably want to revisit that lesson. Click on Administrative Tools, and from there we're going to double click on iSCSI initiator. Now, because I've pre-configured this, it didn't prompt me with the message that you'll probably see at this stage of the game. You'll probably see a message that says, do you want to enable your iSCSI initiator, and do you want to make sure that it gets started automatically every time your server boots? You want to click on yes. Once you click on yes, you're going to get a window just like this. For the target, I want you to enter in the Starwind SAN, or whatever SAN that you are using. In my case, it's 192.168.3.4 is the interface that my Starwind server is configured on to respond to the storage. And once you click on Quick Connect, then it's going to show you these options. These are the LUNs that I had created on the Starwind SAN earlier on, and you'll see that I have, this is your quorum. I have my tier 1 and my tier 2 disks that are connected here. So once you connect all of these disks, you're going to get to a screen that is very similar to this. I'm going to want you to click on Connect, and then we want to add this connection to the list of favorites so that every time it reboots, it's always there and the connection is made. I also want to enable multipath. So I'm going to select multipath, then we're going to click on Advanced. Under Advanced, from a local adapter perspective, we're just going to use the Microsoft iSCSI initiator. From an initiator IP perspective, I have several. What should I use? Let's go ahead and use the server IP address. No, right? We're going to use the interface on the Hyper-V host that we created to connect to storage. And if you recall, and again, if you don't, you should be looking at the earlier video. When we were configuring Hyper-V, we had 4 interfaces created. One was for the management, one was for VM networks, one was for storage, one was for clustering. And if you recall, the subnet that I have dedicated for storage is the .3 subnet. So 192.168.3.1. So you want to make sure that you're configuring the right interface here, otherwise this will not work. So in my case, it's 192.168.3.1. And then you want to select the target portal IP, which in my case is my StarWinds here, with the correct port. So if you've changed the port, again, you want to make sure you keep an eye on that. Once you click on OK, you click on OK again. That is applied. Now you have to do this to all three of them. So we're just going to do this real quick here. And we are going to select again the storage. Click on OK. Click on OK again. Do it to the last one. Click on OK, click on OK. Cool. Now, once you have this, if you go to your favorite targets here, you'll find that they are all available. And this means that they're going to be reconnected every time, again, the server reboots, or if there's a disconnect, or whatever the case might be, you'll have those in here. I'm going to click on OK here. We're going to exit out of here. I don't have anything left to do on this server. So let's go ahead. I want to switch over to my SAN server real quick. I want to show you something on the StarWind SAN so that you see, what I've just connected to, and then we'll go back to the the VMM management console. On the StarWind management console server, so if you double click on it, we're going to right click here. We're going to click on connect real quick. If I go ahead and select and click on configuration, you'll find that down here, from a networking perspective, I have several interfaces. I have the management interface, and I have just a loop back here. And this is the interface on which I wanted to respond. This is what the target portal that we just entered was, and I've gone ahead and disabled these two interfaces from a SAN perspective. This will not prevent you from getting access to the server if you disable it in here. And I've left this as the only one that's enabled and responding on this port, and that's what the target portal ID would be in your case. So I just wanted to make sure that you knew where I got that IP address from and why I was using 3.4 instead of 1.60 in my environment. 1.60 is the management connection to this SAN server. The 3.4 is the storage interface that the rest of the Hyper-V hosts can communicate with the server on that we've created earlier on. Now with that, let's go back to the VMM console. Okay, so far we've created a link between the Hyper-V hosts and the actual storage, and that's great. But now we want to make a link between the virtual machine manager server and our storage. Now, in order for us to do that, what is the enabling technology that would allow VMM to issue commands directly on the storage without necessarily having to do these commands a traditional way on the storage console or on the storage array or the storage manufacturer's console? Anyone? Anyone? Bueller? So if you said SMIS, then you're spot on. SMIS is the enabler of this technology. So what are we supposed to do, Eli? All right, so let me show you what I've done and what you should do from a lab perspective. Again, if you're following along with me. Let's go back to our SAN server real quick. On this server, if you're following along with a StarWind SAN, then on this server, you should have downloaded, as part of the trial version that you are using, the SMIS provider for the SAN. If you have not done that, then you should go and download that as well. Now, once you've downloaded that, and here it is in my case, you just simply double click on it. It's a very simple, very straightforward installation. It will take you right through it, accept all the default, install it on the SAN server, and you are now ready and have enabled this particular SAN to be managed via VMM. And let me show you how we're going to make that connection. So down here under the storage node, under providers, what we're going to do is right click and we're going to click on add storage devices. You're going to be prompted with a welcome screen. What are you trying to connect from a storage provider perspective? Are you trying to connect a Windows-based file server to be managed as a storage device? Are you trying to connect a storage device that is managed by an SMIS provider, which is what we're trying to do? Or down here, if you're trying to add a storage device which is provided, managed by an SMP provider. Well, what I have here is an SMIS, so that's what I'm going to select, and I'm going to go ahead and click on next. Next up, we have to configure the protocol, and in this case it's the SMIS protocol, and you have two options. We are going to select the SMIS- or the SMIS CIM XML as opposed to configuring the protocol to communicate over WMI. So I'm going to go ahead and select that, and where it says provider IP address or fully qualified domain name, I'm going to go ahead and enter the IP address of that SAN server where we have the SMIS provider configured on. Now notice this, I am pointing to the management interface of that SAN provider as opposed to the actual interface where all the LUNs are, where all the iSCSI LUNs are that we've mounted in earlier lessons. So what I'm trying to do here is I want to control the LUNs. I want to control these volumes that are on my SAN server, on my provider, via the management interface. So I'm going to use that management server to issue the commands and control it. So in this case, I'm pointing to the management server as opposed to the other interface, which is used strictly to mount those LUNs to a particular host. I'm going to leave the default port here. If you've changed any defaults, then this would be a good time to do that. And I'm also going to give it a run as account, and I'm going to use this particular one that we've been using here. When I'm ready, I'm going to go ahead and click on next. This will take a few seconds for it to communicate with that particular provider and return all the LUNs that are available for us to control. Once that connection is properly established, you'll find that it automatically detected all of these particular LUNs that we had provisioned. So now these LUNs are now available through VMM. So I'm going to go ahead and click on next. And this is where it becomes super cool. I love this part of the demonstration. So I have these storage LUNs now. Now is where I can classify them. Now is where I can say, well, this particular storage is considered my platinum storage because it's very expensive to me and I know that this is SSD, for example. So in order to do that, the first thing we want to do is we want to create these classifications. So in my environment, I want to create platinum. This is going to be, for instance, let's say SSD, right? Click on add. Let's create another one. And I'm going to call this one gold. And let's call this one maybe SAS 15K, right? And let's add a third one, and I'm going to call this one silver. And maybe this one is SATA, maybe it's SAS. Let's call it SATA just to keep things, consistent. And let's call this one, I don't know, 10K. So now that you have the classifications configured, you can come here and specify what each one is. I know that, for example, my Quorum disk is sitting on SSD right now. So I'm going to associate that with platinum. And let's go ahead and expand this so that you can see it here. Let's do this one. Yeah, there you go. I know that my tier 1 is also associated with SSD, so I'm also going to point that to platinum. And I know that my tier 2, and this is the reason why earlier on, as I was creating these LUNs on my SAN, I classified them as tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. Tier 1 to me makes sense. To a user, it makes absolutely no sense. What is tier 1? I don't know what that is. It's a complicated technical term. So I have to give my complicated technical term a friendly term. And that friendly term that they can understand is, in this case, let's call this one silver, even though it's not really silver. Let's call this one gold. Let's call this one gold just for giggles. And this is what it would look like. Let me just try to change these a little bit here so that they look a little better for us from a classification perspective. So we got 2 platinum and 1 gold standard that we have here in our environment. And again, if you had more, then you can apply more than those types of classification. But what have I done now? So this is the building block of what will later be something that the user can select to provision or to place their services on. And again, this is going to come with an associated cost. So if they're using gold, then you're going to send them a bill at the end of the week or the end of the cycle, charging them for using that gold resource that you are providing. Again, keep in mind, you are turning IT into a services center instead of a cost center. Traditionally, they wouldn't know what this costs. Just give me the fastest disk. They're not paying for it. They're not configuring it. They're not touching it. They didn't know. Now you're holding them responsible and you're building these building blocks to abstract the complexity and make it simple for them. Once this is ready, we're going to click on Next. You're going to get your summary screen here of what it's about to do. We're going to click on Finish. It's going to go through and do its magic. And there you go. Once it's finished, I'm going to go ahead and close out of here. And I have successfully made that connection between Virtual Machine Manager and my SAN using SMIS, and I've configured my classifications. I've configured what my gold standards stand for, what my platinum, what my silver is. You have access here to look at the arrays. Again, you're looking at those disks. You can click on them. You can take a look at what the available capacity is right now, etc., etc. This gives you a good, really nice summary here of what's going on. If you have any file servers, this is where you would be able to, again, create those file servers if you had to. From a classifications perspective, again, you can take a look at them instead of looking at them from an array perspective to find out, how much available resources you have. It's really cool because it aggregates everything that's gold, and it tells you from a gold perspective what you have left. It'll tell you from a platinum perspective what you have left, and from a silver perspective what you have left. Again, it's starting to create that abstraction layer. Instead of dealing with individual LUNs, individual arrays, you are dealing with things that are aggregated to make more sense to you, to make your life easier once they are configured. Now, and that is the magic word, is that a private cloud, as you can see, requires a lot of pre-configuration of these things that need to come together in order to provide that private cloud. So what did we talk to in this really cool lesson? And by the way, I am really, really interested in getting your feedback on this lesson, because I've poured my knowledge into clarifying and summarizing what a private cloud is, how your role is evolving, why it is needed. So we talked a lot about why it's needed and the fact that consumerization is what's literally driving private cloud. And it's not driving it from a technical perspective, it's driving it from teaching our users that they can get access to services instantly. So when they come back into the enterprise and we tell them 2 weeks because I got to order a server and storage and configure it and add it to the domain and all the things that we do, they're looking at it saying, well, I can go to Amazon and get a server right away. Well, why do I need this complexity? And again, I'm simplifying this, but this is a use case that exists. I come across a lot of these customers that are dealing with problems with specifically their marketing department that's going out and doing its own thing. But private cloud has obviously its other uses for you, for some other users within your environment. Maybe they're developers that are requiring access to these resources. So we talked about what the fabric was, and I'm hoping that the fabric after this whole conversation is really now clear as far as why I need this fabric, because I'm trying again to abstract the complexity of creating the network and the logical network and the VLANs and the load balancers and the VIPs and the storage and the LUNs and all of that. Abstract all of that to the fabric and use it as a foundation for creating the automations that we're going to be creating later on in this course. We talked about what we need to do from a networking perspective. We configured some static IP resource pools. We went through the configuration of that. We talked about some of the newer features of Service Pack 1, like the logical switches and the native port profiles and what those mean, the port classifications. We then moved on to talk about storage. We made the connection with the storage server through SMIS. We imported those storage LUNs, and we took a look at how we classify the different storage LUNs that we have, either via platinum, gold, or silver. Finally, I hope this was very informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.